In struggle and love, we need to tell everyone there is more than enough. Talk about working folks, war and peace, hungry for honesty, hope and release. Trying to stay alive until I die. I don't ask for guarantees, but I need high fidelity.
I want protection for our children. I don't want to have to fear that my 12-year-old son will be murdered just for being black. I want justice. I want the cops to do their job and not abuse their power. Serve and protect. That is their job, not murder. I want the cover-up to stop. There was no fourth man. And no more drinking on the job. I want accountability in the police department. Let them be held responsible for murder.
Well, hate on the trigger. It's a deafening sound. A faggot will hit the ground. A day in the life of the great machine. Men in hoods of a white parade in the streets. Another mass trial after murdering
40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50.
Welcome to a special edition of the Battle for Progressive Media. I'm John Riley, today's host. Racism, the struggle for national liberation at home and abroad, and the struggle against patriarchy took U.S. society on a roller coaster ride in the 1960s. A century before, these struggles almost turned over the capitalist apple cart in the South, and for a few brief years, a radical democracy transformed the lives of black and white working people for the better during the Reconstruction period following the U.S. Civil War. Today, I'll be interviewing Chip Smith about his new book called The Cost of Privilege, Taking on the System of White Supremacy and Racism, published by Camino Press. We'll also be interviewing Juliet Ucelli, who contributed by researching for the book. Chip Smith is a longtime anti-racist activist, socialist, and was for 10 years a rank-and-file labor activist and union shop steward in the Philadelphia area. Chip received a PhD in economics at Temple University in 1994. He helped found the Fayetteville Peace with Justice campaign that organized 3 marches on the anniversary of the Iraq War. The group builds opposition to the war among military personnel stationed at nearby Fort Bragg. Juliet Ucelli is a longtime public school social worker, school change organizer, and social justice activist. She was co-initiator of Italian Americans for Multicultural United States, a group that was founded in 1992 to oppose the glorification of Christopher Columbus, support the anti-quincentennial campaigns in many communities of color, and reclaim progressive aspects of Italian American history. She is based in New York City and is a member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Her published writings include reviews and articles such as You Don't Have to Be Non-European to Dislike Eurocentrism, and with Don Murphy, Race, Knowledge, and Pedagogy, a black and white teacher dialogue. The existence of racism is in dispute. The right would have us believe that we live in a colorblind society. Many liberals believe that there may be vestiges of racism, but it's a problem that's largely solved and now is a problem of lack of initiative. Chip Smith, how do you respond to that?
The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s brought awareness to a lot of people that hadn't realized it before, that there was racism in the United States. But there was a kind of a shift in the 1970s, and the right was able to convince people that the civil rights movement had taken care of all those issues. And so pretty much for the past 2 decades and a half, white people have believed that by and large the issue of racism has been taken care of. So it's ironic, within like a 10 or 15 year period, people went from not thinking there was any such thing as racism to thinking that now it's all been taken care of.
Many white people might say that things were bad 100 years ago during Jim Crow segregation, or even 50 years ago before the Civil Rights Movement. But now all of that is in the past. Things are different now. In support of this view are the images we see every day: people of color as sports figures, movie and TV stars, religious leaders, authors, and politicians. The reality, however, is that once you get past these mostly media-shaped public images, the lives that the majority of people live in the United States remain largely separate and unequal. There are benefits of being a white working-class person in the early 21st century U.S. You have less than half the chance of dying as an infant compared to an African American. 5.7 deaths per 1,000 live births for whites versus 14 deaths for African Americans. Young white males have 1/5 the chance of being under correctional supervision compared to African Americans. 1 in 15 whites is under correctional supervision. That means in prison, on parole, or on probation, versus 1 in 3 African Americans. You have less than half the chance of being unemployed, 4.8% for whites versus 10.9% for African Americans.
The median family income for white people is about 40% higher than for African Americans. $55,768 for the white median family versus $34,369 for the African American median family, and $34,272 for Latino family, the median family. The white median family has 10 times as much wealth, that's assets minus debts, compared to African American family. So for a white median family, it's $106,400, that's the wealth they hold, versus $10,700 for African American family. In addition to these, there are advantages in education, inheritance, employment, housing, health and health care, and retirement.
Why do you think so many people think that racism's been solved?
The whole idea of having a colorblind society takes the question of white privilege and the downside of that privilege for people of color in the country off the table. And so as the quote that Juliet read says, the media helps project an image of advancement when the reality, which doesn't make it into most of the TV shows and the kind of water cooler conversations we have, doesn't reflect the reality of inequality in the country. And then as a result of that, with this idea of the country being colorblind and everyone being equal, then it's not a question of having to do anything about racial inequality.
In The Cost of Privilege, taking on the system of white supremacy and racism, you examine the central role that the struggle against racism and white supremacy has had in progressive change in the United States. Chip, can you talk about why you wrote the book?
You have to have a little background for that, I think. Having been an activist for many years and being aware of the importance of racism in the social justice movement, but somewhat vague in my thinking like 30, 40 years ago when I started out, the book A House Divided, which came out in 1981, was important because it brought forward the importance of privilege on the white people's side in understanding the role of race in the United States. And that book was influential with me and with other friends of mine. And so when the year 2000 rolled around, and there was initiatives then and underway now as well to try to build a more influential left in the country by bringing together both organized socialists and people in the popular movements, the feeling was it was be important to, in the course of that effort, to bring, to present, to encourage discussion about the ideas that A House Divided laid out 20 years before. But that book is dated, and so the idea was, well, let's do an update of A House Divided. But we live in very different conditions now. I mean, that, in a sense, the House Divided was written after the upsurge of the 60s and 70s, and it was kind of a summation of that period. And now we've lived in a pretty much a right-wing, right-dominant kind of political atmosphere for 20-some years. People aren't aware of history. Like we said before, people feel the race, some 60% of white people feel pretty much that the issues around race have been taken care of. And so as we got into writing the book, it became a deeper project, trying to draw on history, try to be persuasive about a number of questions that even people on the left are not particularly on the left, because that's where efforts to bring people together are underway, are not in agreement on. And so we've take on a question of privilege, the existence of an oppressed black nation in the South, Chicano Nation in the Southwest, and try to give historical depth to these so that they don't sound like issues that just kind of come out of nowhere, but come out of the history of struggle of people in the United States.
Chip, in the first chapter you discuss the origin of the so-called white race and white supremacy, not in a biological sense, but in a political and cultural sense. What specifically do you mean by white supremacy, and what do you mean by the statement that the white race is socially constructed? Sometimes people think that when you talk about white supremacy, you're only talking about the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, the early days of colonial days in what became the United States, there really was no awareness of whiteness or white people. In fact, for the first 50 years and more, the plantations in the South were run by indentured white working class people from England, and the conditions they faced, as Lerone Bennett Jr. says, actually set the groundwork for the treatment of later treatment of slaves around whipping and branding and all kinds of horrendous treatment. And but the rebellion in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, which united white and black indentured servants and free farmers, put a scare into the elite of that period. And as a result of that, the Lord Berkeley and the colonial elite decided to implement, they didn't sit down and, you know, hash it out in one meeting or something, but step by step implemented policies which benefited the white workers and enslaved black people and drove a wedge between them. And that's when the white race was created. In fact, legal documents of that period begin to use the term white around 1700, which had not been the case before that.
Okay. It also seems that there was like political considerations in the determination of these privileges. Wasn't there a fairly strong workers' movement emerging in England at the time that would have made enslaving whites politically untenable?
Well, my recollection is that a decisive event in that period of changeover was that for the first time the British had a source of slaves on the west coast of Africa, which had not been the case before. They'd pretty much just been pirates and had robbed the Dutch slave ships. But then they got a steady supply of slaves from the west coast of Africa, which then cheapened slaves compared to indentured servants. And in fact, in 1712, then the British received the asiento, which was basically the papal blessing to carry the carry slaves from Africa to the Spanish colonies as well as to North America. So that availability of a cheaper source of African people to be enslaved in North America was a key factor in terms of the switchover.
It seems that one of the important things about Bacon's Rebellion, which Chip mentioned, was that it was a united uprising of both black and Native American and whites working on the plantations. So it became clear that this was a big danger for the ruling elite. So they needed to cement a system in which would separate the people who could potentially ally against them, and by winning the exploited white people to believe that they were part of a superior race, served that function.
The first half of the book deals with the white race, racism, national oppression, and the potential for building a socialist movement to challenge the system. You talk in the book about the oppressed nations of the Sun Belt, advancing the idea that there's a distinct African American and Chicano nation in addition to the indigenous nations. That Native Americans are composed of many nations is not a new idea to most white Americans. People who know a bit about history aren't surprised by the concept of a Chicano nation, since the U.S. annexed half of Mexico in the War of 1848. But many have never thought of African Americans as a nation. Where did this concept arise, and why should progressive people learn more about it?
Well, I think there's two parts to answer that. One is the actual historic development of African Americans, and then the other is when did that idea of an oppressed nation kind of crystallize out and become part of discourse on the left. And a number of studies, Lerone Bennett Jr. again takes the developing sense of peoplehood among Africans back into the earliest days in the 1700s, when people were set apart to work the land, and in the course of that began to develop a distinct identity separate from their origins in Africa and separate from the dominant culture. But then during the Civil War, you know, the turning point in the Civil War centered around black soldiers volunteering when the draft met resistance among white working class people, particularly in New York. And then in the period after that, there were hopes, but during the Reconstruction period, that there could be the possibility of real equality within the country. But then when the Reconstruction was defeated, different national sentiments came out among African people, although and one manifestation was in the different migration movements where people would migrate out of the South. There was an attempt in 1879 called the Exodusters to move out of the South using the imagery of the Exodus and resettle in Kansas and Oklahoma. And there were also emigration movements to Africa. During this period also, as the country became increasingly moving toward the Jim Crow segregation period of right around the turn of the century, different spokespeople for different sectors of the black community that came forward in this period from, say, 1880 into the early 20th century. Ida B. Wells was a journalist. Booker T. Washington was a spokesman for a sector of the business elite within the developing black economies in the South and in the different urban areas. W.E.B. Du Bois and Hubert Harrison were intellectuals who debated with and struggled with the left, with the Socialist Party, and then Cyril Briggs with the Communist Party when it got founded in the early 1920s to raise the importance of black workers and the central importance of organizing black workers. So in the course of this period, when the walls of segregation were being built by presidents like Woodrow Wilson, who extended segregation to the federal, the whole federal office, among federal office workers. During this period, then people began to shape and develop their own social reality, their own sense of peoplehood, and also it corresponded to the time when the U.S. began to move beyond the borders, wage war against the Philippines for 3 years right around the year 1900, and so the Jim Crow period characterized both what was happening inside the United States, enforced by lynching and other forms of terror, and also characterized policy external to the country. And so as the U.S. became more of an imperialist power, in fact, even the mainstream textbooks call that period the era of imperialism, the commonality of oppressed people inside the United States and those oppressed outside the United States, as in the Philippines, became clearer, and the sense of people wanting to determine their future kind of on their own, being forced to do that because of the door having been shut during the Reconstruction period, came more to the fore. So that's the historic piece. Now the awareness of that was developed in the 1920s by the Communist Party of the United States, and that's a party which today few people know about. Few people know about the history of struggles in the 1920s and 30s and the important role that leftists played in organizing the workplaces throughout the country, and they developed with help from the Communist International based in Moscow, an analysis which saw black people in the South being an oppressed nation, characterized by having a common land, common language, common culture, and historically established community of people, and that was the first time that the left or any social progressive, mainly white organizations had viewed the struggle of black people in the country as having its own validity and worthy of being raised as a core struggle for people seeking social justice in the country, and then it turned out that then was able to invigorate the Communist Party's organizing in the South and in the northern urban areas during the 1930s, when they made a lot of gains. And then by 1940 or so, the party was called by many people a Negro Party, or the Party of the American Negro.
We're talking with Chip Smith and Juliet Ucelli about their new book, The Cost of Privilege, Taking on the System of White Supremacy and Racism. Juliet Ucelli, what is national oppression in the U.S. context?
By national oppression, we mean the unequal treatment that people suffer who are, say, African American or Chicano or Native American, across all classes, but just principally because of that national racial identity. So if we look at police violence, why did people come up with the phrase driving while black? Why is a young black man shot by police on the night before his wedding out at a club with the presumption that he must be some kind of a criminal and no weapon found? We also have to look at the differences in wealth and income that we alluded to earlier as an aspect of national oppression. So for example, between African Americans and whites at the same educational level, the African Americans and the Chicanos will generally, across the board, have lower incomes and less wealth. We look at segregated housing and redlining as aspects of national oppression, which still exist in some of our major cities and towns to this very day, and the simple fact about who can't get a cab to stop on the streets of New York City, even when dressed in a Burberry coat and a briefcase sometimes. So those are some examples of how national oppression manifests itself.
Chip, what do you mean by the cost of privilege?
Well, the cost of privilege tries to convey the idea that although white people have benefited from, the white people have benefited over the years by, for example, homesteading in the West, or the redlining that Juliet just mentioned, the GI Bill after World War II, and those kinds of things, that nonetheless white working class people are exploited. And more than that, the kind of divisions that exist between white people and oppressed people have also cost white people over the years. So when you look back in history, for example, and you see the lynchings and with kids in a party atmosphere, you have to feel that those people and those kids paid a price for the segregated life they lived under. I mean, that's even beyond the fact that research has shown where the privileges were the greatest, as in the South, the wage level of the white workers there was less than elsewhere in the country. So there was a monetary price paid as well for the disunity that existed between working people of different races. So that's one way to understand the cost of privilege. Another is in just living today, the fears that many white people feel about going into the city, or being afraid of kind of opening their mouths and saying stuff around black people or other people of color for fear they're going to say something wrong. Those kind of barriers to kind of normal and relations of solidarity among people who share many of the same concerns and needs and hopes. That's a real cost. When we look back in history and we see the struggles of people in the Civil War, or we see the history of lynching or the Native people's struggles, or the resistance of the Chicano and the Mexicano people to the annexation of the Southwest, white folks will put distance between ourselves and those struggles as if, well, they belong to somebody else, rather than recognizing that those struggles belong to all of us, and that really the hope for the future is for our ability to identify with those struggles, make them their own, and with that kind of deeper sense of a common history, be able then to build a future. And then the last piece of the cost of privilege is all of the potential that's out there for us to transform this society and make it into a society that really serves the need of working class people and the broad majority of people in the country. That has no chance so long as race and white privilege hold sway.